Well, good deal. It's good morning. Welcome to the Beasley Allen webinar. I'm Chris Glover. I am work in our Atlanta office in our personal injury and products liability section of our law firm. I saw the registration list and recognized a lot of friends and folks that we've worked with many times before on the list. And I just want to welcome you. I saw a lot of names I didn't recognize. And for you, I'll give you a brief introduction of who I am. I'm a products liability lawyer, again, working out of our Atlanta office. I've handled products liability cases my entire career. I tell people often my first deposition was in Dearborn, Michigan in the Ford Motor Company case, where I deposed a employee of Ford Motor Company in a case. And I've kind of done that for the last 23 or 24 years, where I've watched product liability world change in many ways, and the kind of defects that we pursue have changed, but the way that we do it's basically the same. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about something that's really dear to me today, and I'll tell you a little bit about that in a moment. But we're super glad that you're here. Our firm hosts these webinars, and we're happy to do it. We love giving out the CLE credit for these. We have several more planned for the remainder of the year. If you're interested in joining any of these, you can go to www.beasleyallen.com/events, and you can look at the webinars we've got for the remainder of the year planned. And I know that we've got some great lawyers from my firm hosting some of these. I've got some more that I'm happy about, I'm excited about doing, and they'll be coming up later in the year. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the cases that we're working on. My partner, Alyssa Bascom, who I think is online, and I are working on several rear end crashworthiness cases. And so you might ask, what is that? Well, we all handle rear end crash cases. If you do auto crashes, you will handle a rear end crash. Matter of fact, the most common crash is a frontal crash into the rear of another vehicle. That is the most common crash that there is. And so we all know about whiplash cases. We all know about people who have neck injury cases and surgical cases, and those can be great cases too. But what happens when the injuries are worse? What happens when you have catastrophic injuries due to a rear end collision? And you could surmise in many of those cases, well, this crash was just so severe that they were hurt badly. Or you could look and say, was it really? Was it? And so that's really what I want to raise your attention to today, is the fact that many of these rear end crashes may not be as severe or as unavoidable as you may think initially looking at the case. And so I began looking at these cases several years ago. I had a case, and I happened to have the striking vehicle, and by that I mean the vehicle who struck my client's car. And I'll show you what really raised my attention to this defect and this theory, and how I went about proving that case and some of the others that we've worked on. But before I do that, I want to share with you a little bit about some of the big principles that you got to know about in order to pursue these cases. And so I'll share my screen with you now. I put together a presentation that we have on crashworthiness cases, and these in particular rear crashworthiness cases. And I want to talk to you about this guy, Hugh DeHaven. Hugh DeHaven is the father of crashworthiness. He was in a plane crash way back in 1917, and after having been in that plane crash, he spent the rest of his career studying what does it mean to build a crashworthiness vehicle. He looked at airplanes, he looked at cars, and essentially crashworthiness is the ability of a structure to protect its occupants. And today, in all 50 states, it is the law. The state of Georgia has crashworthiness principles and products liabilities law. Cars have to be made to protect occupants in foreseeable collisions, according to state law. And then there's federal laws and NHTSA, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration standards that apply to the design of vehicles, and they have to be made pursuant to those standards. And we'll talk a little bit about those. But what he looked at is why in the same crash, you may have different outcomes. And so if you've got the same amount of energy in a crash, two different crashes, all of them occur at the same speed, same energy, why is it one occupant of a vehicle may turn out better than the other? And so oftentimes, or most of the time, the answer is the design of the vehicle, the design of the structure that's made. And so he looked at what do we need to be doing to get better outcomes in all crashes? And so he looked at things such as, he creates this list of principles. And the first principle that he came up with, and he calls it packaging engineers, because you are packaging human beings inside of the vehicle. But the principle states that the vehicle should not collapse under reasonable or expected conditions of force. And I tell people often, I say, look, if you were hit by a train, there is no car in the world that's going to protect you. That is not a reasonable or expected condition of force. That's not something that's truly, because the best vehicle in the world is going to crush. If you get hit going, 100 miles an hour, no vehicle is going to do any better than the worst vehicle. People are going to die, unfortunately. But when you are hit in what's called a foreseeable crash, the type crashes that the car companies know are going to happen, that they test for in many occasions, and that the world sees on a day-to-day basis on these type crashes, then cars should be made to not collapse under those conditions. And when they do, they're defective. And so that's what we're looking for in these cases. That's kind of the first step in deciding, do you have a case? Was the crash foreseeable? Was it something that a car company, if they wanted to set out to make the car safe, could they have done so? And so that's the first thing we look at. The second principle is similar, but you must not be made of brittle or frail materials, and they should resist force by yielding and absorbing energy applied to the outer container so as to cushion and distribute the impact. Now, that's kind of complicated, but if you can see me on my screen, and I'll get a vehicle out here. And so this is a car, right? And you can see it here. What you've got to do when you're building a car is you've got to make that car very soft in what's called the crush zone or the crash zone. Vehicles need to be able to crush. Why? Because if a car was infinitely rigid, it couldn't crush at all. Then what would happen is you would be in a crash. It wouldn't crush at all, and the people inside it would come to a complete stop. If they were going 50 miles an hour in the crash, they would go from 50 to 0 instantaneous, because the car wouldn't crush with them at all, and that would be extremely dangerous for them. People would break necks and be seriously injured. So car companies, what they do in the front of the vehicle, and then again in the back of the vehicle, in the area that they have to work with between the bumper and the occupant compartment, they create what's called crush zones. Vehicles are made to crush in those areas. If you see a vehicle that's crushed in the crush zone, then it did what it was supposed to do. But what you've got to do when you're building a vehicle is you've got to stop that crush before it reaches the occupant, because then you've got a different problem. No longer are you worried about the heavy accelerations from stopping instantly. Now you're worried about a worse problem called intrusion into the occupant compartment. We've all seen it in our cases where the car is crushed in on the occupant and they had no more room left to survive. Well, we've got to prevent that from happening in these foreseeable crashes. Again, sometimes you can. If you get hit by a train or a super high speed collision, then the occupant compartment's going to crush. It can't be helped. But in those foreseeable crashes, what you want to do is you want to build it such that the crush stops before you reach the occupant, so that the occupant compartment doesn't experience intrusion. And this is done by putting high strength steels and reinforced zones with high strength steels around the occupant so that the crush stops at that point. And so that's what DeHaven's talking about here in his second principle. And so the first vehicle that I ever looked at is this one. It's a Chevrolet Cavalier. And as you can see in this, it was severe crush. I mean, massive crush of the Chevrolet Cavalier. And so my first impression, having looked at this vehicle, is, my gosh, this car was hit in a super high speed collision. This was a unforeseeable crash. There's nothing that Chevrolet could have done to prevent this from happening. In fact, in this case, the lady in the front seat, my client, was crushed despite being in the front seat of the car, crushed all the way through the trunk, all the way through the back seat, all the way through the front seat. And she lost her survival space. The intrusion reached her. And so it went through the crush zones that's designed to crush. The occupant compartment was not sufficiently strong to keep it getting to her. And she unfortunately passed in the case. So I'm thinking, gosh, this is a severe collision. What was this? How bad was this crash? So what do I want to do? I want to go look at the other vehicle that was in the crash. And I'm thinking, well, they had the exact same forces, the exact same energy that was imparted on this Cavalier was imparted to the vehicle that struck it. And so I must be looking for a car that's going to look similar. It's going to be massively crushed as well. And the person who was in that car is probably dead also. And so I look at that car, and well, first off, this is a picture of the back of the car, and you can see how the crush occurred. Another picture of the back of my client's Cavalier, and it's crushed there from that angle too. Well, here's the car that hit it, and that's when I start scratching my head, saying, okay, well, why did this? This is just a little Nissan 240, little sports car. It experienced the exact same speed, energy, delta V forces. All of it was the same, except it's nowhere near as crushed. It doesn't have anywhere near the damage that the Cavalier has. Matter of fact, this is you can see there is some crush of the crush zone on the front of the Nissan, but yet the occupant compartment is completely intact. The occupant compartment is not crushed at all. And the person who was driving this Nissan 240 was uninjured and walked away from the crash. And so despite having experienced the exact same forces that our clients experienced, this client or this person walks away from the crash and is uninjured. And so that's when I start saying, okay, something went wrong here. And I go back to these principles that I learned about from Hugh DeHaven, and I say, okay, this was a foreseeable crash. Nissan foresaw it. Nissan foresaw that this car might be in a crash like this, and they made their car to protect their occupant. Why didn't Chevrolet Cavalier do the same when it experienced the same forces? And so we began to analyze the case a little closer. And what we were able to do is look at some force deflection curves. And that's a complicated an engineering analysis that was done on this particular case. But what we were able to do was look at, from crash test, where did this vehicle crush, and how much force, how much resistance did it have? So if I were to take this piece of paper that I've got sitting on my desk, it doesn't take much. The same force of my hand will crush this thing all the way in, right? It's going to crush this paper very easily. If I push the exact same force of my hand on this highlighter, it's not going to crush it at all, because the ability of the highlighter to resist my pressure is much stronger. It's a much higher force takes to crush it. Well, we can look at cars the same way, and that's what we did in this case. We looked at the crush necessary, or the forces necessary to crush the Cavalier. And so what we could see here is, going back to front, you'll see that first blue peak in my force deflection curves is the bumper. And so what you see is it takes a lot of force to crush that bumper. It's about right under 2,000 pounds of force to crush that bumper on the Cavalier. And but yet then they have this gap between what is the entire trunk of the vehicle. That's your crush zone. Well, they wasted this crush zone space. And now I told you the crush zone is supposed to crush, but it's got to absorb some energy, right? It's got to resist some. Well, what the trunk of many cars are made out of is sheet metal. It's not much thicker than a Coke can. There's no above the bumper, there's no structure in that area of the car that's going to resist any force at all. And in that particular vehicle, as you can see, the most that it absorbed was about 600 pounds of force until you get to the back seat, where it peaks back up again. And there is some resistance there at the back seat, but it's much less than even the bumper. Whereas the occupant compartment should be made of high strength steels. Again, as I showed you on my model, you've got to stop that crush. It needs to be very rigid there, because you have to stop the crush. And then you get into the midship region of the car, which is the occupant compartment itself. And you can see that the structure just continues to crush and is never as strong as it was there at the bumper. So in that situation, we were able to say that look, Chevrolet could have done a lot more here to keep this vehicle from crushing. They could have done what Nissan did on the front of the vehicle in the back. There's no reason why the back of the vehicle, there's no engineering reason why the back of the vehicle couldn't be made as safe as the front. Matter of fact, many cars do that. And so what we did is we took this and we looked at how did that same car do, how did the Cavalier do in the front of the vehicle? So when we were able to look at the force deflection curves on the front of the vehicle. And so the red line reflects the energy that this car has in frontal crashes. And what does it do? Well, it does exactly what I explained to you with my model. It gets progressively harder as you get closer to the occupant. Why? Because you've got to stop the crush before it gets to the occupant. You can't let it get to let it get into the cabin, or you crush your occupants. And so in the frontal crash, it gets stronger and stronger and stronger until it stops the crush. And that's why had this Cavalier been in a frontal collision, these people would have been okay. Just like the Nissan was fine, it did the same thing. Its force deflection curves go up and up and up and up in the front. Well, why do they do that? Why do the car companies do that? Why don't they make the rear of the vehicle just as strong as the back? Well, they don't have to, and so they don't. There are numerous frontal crash tests that the federal government, organizations like the Institute for Highway Safety, IIHS, Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, they have testing for the front of the vehicles, and they get 5-star ratings. They get star ratings by IIHS based on how well their cars perform in frontal impacts and whether the occupants would have been injured in those same impacts. And so those that are looked at and tested, and if they don't do well in those, then they can't sell their vehicles. It's bad for marketing to do poorly and get a poor star rating. And so they put a lot of energy into a lot of effort into protecting their cars in frontal crashes. Well, there's only one test for rear impacts, and that's a fuel system test. There is no occupant, and this is disappointing. The federal government's never forced them to protect occupants in rear collisions, and so many car companies don't. Many car companies don't take the extra steps to protect occupants in rear collisions because they don't have to. And so what they do, they just protect, as long as the fuel system doesn't leak. Everybody in the car can die in a rear collision, but the fuel system doesn't leak, then the car passes. That's the bottom line. And so they don't protect occupants. They create, if you go back to the Cavalier pictures, what you'll see is that the car kind of folds around the gas tank. It's designed to fold around it and envelop that. It envelops the gas tank to protect the gas tank, even though it crushes the occupant compartment. And that's what they designed it to do. Here's an overhead picture of the Cavalier. And one of the things you can see is that the doors all popped open in the crash. But yet none of the doors were crushed in that case. And so one of the things that car companies can and should do is to protect that car from crushing in the crash is they have to tie the front of the structure up at the vehicles up in front of in the engine compartment all the way to the back, so that there's a complete line of energy absorption from front to back. And they do that with door beams. You've got door beams, solid, heavy steel door beams inside the doors that connect the front of the vehicle all the way to the back. And so if you're in one of these collisions, the doors help keep the back end from crushing. Well, that's no good if the doors pop open. Your doors are only as good as your door latches. And so in this situation, when the door latches failed and the doors popped open, those door beams that were designed to keep that back end from crushing the way that it did, that they didn't get crushed at all. They didn't absorb any of the energy, the forces that were imparted in this vehicle. Unlike the Nissan, that's doors stayed closed, and those door beams did a great job of absorbing energy and kept the front of that car from crushing all the way to the back. This aerial view allows you to see just how bad my client was crushed. She was in that passenger seat there in the front, and she was pushed forward all the way into the dash. And if you were to ask me, what's your chances in life of dying in a rear collision where you're in the front seat? I'd say I think pretty low. There's a lot of space between me and the back. There's a lot of room to crush, but yet that's exactly what happened to this poor client. This is another case that we're currently working on now. Alyssa and I are, along with our friend Bruce Hagan in Decatur. And this is a similar situation. This poor young man was in the back seat. Miles, young man, was crushed in the back seat. And yet look at his car compared to the one that hit him. Miles was in the back seat of the black Toyota Corolla at the top, and the Volkswagen Tiguan that was in the bottom is down in the red there. As you can see, similar to what we looked at in the Nissan and the Chevrolet, the crush is nowhere near the same. You've got a gigantic disparity, yet these cars experience the exact same forces in the crash. And so we looked at that in this case, or we're looking at that in this case. And another picture here, you can see poor Miles was killed in this crash. He had a horrific hangman fracture. The forces of his crash were so severe and reached him directly in this crash, so much so that it broke his neck. And yet the car that hit him, the lady, she got out of her car after the wreck was over with and was uninjured, because you can see the crush never reaches her occupant compartment, nothing close to reaching her. And so that's a reason why she wasn't injured. You can look here and you can see how his occupant space was removed. He was crushed forward, and he lost the occupant space that he should have had to protect him. In fact, you can see in that bottom right-hand picture that hit the back of his seat was pressed forward. As the crush reached all the way through to his seat and pushed him forward. It looks like he's got more room here than he had, because the seat in front of him is leaned forward now. The EMTs moved that forward, trying to get him out of the car. But at the time of the crash, it would have been further back and removed his survival space. Why did this happen? Well, this is the 301 test. This is the fuel system test that I told you about, the test that they have to run by the federal government in order to sell the vehicle. And yet they don't have to ever look at this test to determine if it's going to protect an occupant at all. All they've got to do is protect the fuel system. And so, as you can see, they've got an occupant in the front seat, a dummy, but they don't put a dummy in the back seat. And see if we can play this video here. Watch the crush of this. Watch where it goes. That passed. Why? The fuel system didn't leak, but yet the crush goes all the way through the trunk and gets through into the back seat. I mean, it crushes the rear door. The rear door is crushed. Let's watch this again. We can pause it. Look, there. You can also see here that the dummy in the front seat flies backwards. You can see that the back seat is pushed forward, and he's lost his occupant survival space. If anybody in the back seat of this vehicle, yet this passes. You can sell this vehicle. Why? The fuel system didn't crush. This is a test run at 55 miles per hour, what the government has deemed a foreseeable speed. Toyota runs it at this speed, and this is the federal mandated test that you've got to run at. And yet the vehicle crushes in that test. Does it have to be that way? Well, what about some other vehicles? How do they do? Well, this is, I've said, well, how would the car that was the Volkswagen Tiguan do, the one that was in this, that hit our client? Well, how would it do if it got hit in the back? And so I looked at that and I found this crash test. Let me fast forward so we don't have to watch the whole thing. Here is the crash test. Boom. You can watch it from the other side. Boom. This is the exact same test. The exact same thing strikes it. The exact same energy goes into the back of the Volkswagen Tiguan, and you can see slow speed here. Well, that's the video. On the right-hand side, I have frozen the Volkswagen Tiguan at the point of maximum intrusion. It never reaches the rear door. Matter of fact, it stops at the rear wheels. And you can see there's nowhere near as much crush into the back seat of the Tiguan as there was on the Toyota Corolla. Exact same crash. Just like we looked at the principles that Mr. DeHaven had in his why do two different vehicles perform differently in the same crash? Well, those two performed very differently in the same crash. Here's another one we can watch involving a Volkswagen Jetta. So this is another sedan. And as you can see here, the crush doesn't get to the back seat. It doesn't get to the rear doors. You can watch the video here and I'll fast forward it again. So we get through a lot of the preliminary stuff of the test and watch. Boom. I mean, it hits it hard, but yet you can watch here in this slow motion version. That's as far as the crush goes there. The crush never reaches the back seat. It does what it's supposed to do. It crushes and stops in the occupant compartment, is so strong that the crush stops and doesn't reach the occupant. They've got survival space and they live in this crash. And so you can make a car strong. It doesn't have to crush the way that the Corolla crushed. This is another case that we're looking at, and it's a little bit of a different issue, although there are a lot of the same issues. In this case, we've got a case against, this is another case that we're pursuing with Darren Penn, and we're working together on this case and teaming up, and it's a great team. The two of us love working with him and his firm on these cases. Darren and I are looking at this case. We've got really two theories in this case. One, we've got a theory against Honda for the structure that they've made. They have no structure protecting occupants above the bumper. As you can see, the bumper is roughly where it was at the beginning of the crash. Yet the top of it, where they have no reinforcements, no high strength steel, they used no upper load pass that would protect the crush from stopping in this case. All the way through the occupant compartment. And then another part of that case is, in fact, we got a lift kit that was put on this Jeep. And I'll talk a lot more about that. By putting this lift kit on the Jeep, the lift kit completely bypasses the primary energy absorbing structures of the Honda. The primary energy absorbing structures of the Honda are the bumper and the frame rails down at the bottom that you can see weren't really crushed much. They were folded down a little bit, but they don't experience much crush at all. Why? Because the bumper goes over them, crushes straight through that tin can, Coke can structure that Honda's got on their vehicle, and it doesn't absorb any energy at all. It just goes straight through it. And so we say that the lift kit completely defeats the purpose of the crashworthiness structures on cars. And these things are extremely dangerous. I can't stand lift kits. I hope that if you got one, you'll consider lowering your vehicle, because these things are so high that kids like this young man, Dominic Perez, he is a sweet little boy. He's the best client I've ever had. Is unprotected in this crash because of look at the Jeep. It looks like it was barely in a crash. I mean, the Jeep looks like, it looks like you could just drive it off. It's hardly damaged. And yet look at the Honda, the same exact energy, same exact forces. Here's the shocking thing. We download the black box on the vehicles. It's an 18.5-mile Delta V. An 18.5-mile-an-hour Delta V crash. That's why the Jeep looks like it does. It was in an 18.5-mile-an-hour crash. But why does the Honda look that way? The Honda looks that way by a combination of insufficient structure on the Honda and a extremely high incompatible vehicle created by the lift kit. This is Dominic, and he's such a sweet kid. Dominic now is a ventilator dependent quadriplegic because of this, and it breaks my heart. But he is, look at that smile underneath his COVID mask. He smiles. The only muscles he really has that work is his face, and he never stops smiling. He is a great kid, and I just when I say I love him, I love him. And so what are we looking at here? Should the lift kit people know? Should the car manufacturers know? Modifications to cars result in an excessive increase in the ride height of brake vehicles may create a mismatch in the geometric alignment of energy absorbing structures. That's what they're doing when they're putting lift kits on vehicles. These modifications that increase the ride height create a complete mismatch. And therefore, the energy absorbing structures of the vehicle are bypassed, and you can't protect occupants. What we're reading from is proposed model legislation that the lift kit people were involved in. They know this, yet they sell these things anyway. There was in 2012, there was a lot of talk. We started having much more SUVs on the road. In the 70s and the 80s. The most people who drove large trucks were people who worked on farms, people who worked in construction, large companies, but there weren't as many day-to-day people driving around in trucks. Now, high school kids who had never been on a farm drive, big, huge Chevrolet trucks and Ford trucks and things. Not only that, you got moms who are driving gigantic SUVs, Suburbans to tow kids around. And so we had this issue that really developed in the 2000s that they began to look at. How do we solve this problem with all these larger vehicles on the road that we didn't have 30, 40 years ago? Most people drove around in sedans. So they start saying, well, let's do this. Let's address this by what's called vehicle-to-vehicle compatibility. Let's make cars energy absorbing structures line up. And the federal government proposes this. All the car companies agree to it. And what they do is they agree to put their bumpers between a height of 16 and 20 inches. Your bumper has to be in that area of 16 to 20 inches so that it will catch the other bumper. If you're not in that 16 to 20 inches range, you have to have what's called a secondary energy absorbing device that hangs down below your bumper, and it's like a second bumper that is lower than the first bumper. And so it would then catch the energy absorbing structure of the vehicle that it strikes. And so under this agreement that all car companies agree to, now all cars have bumpers in this range. Well, what happens when you add a lift kit to a vehicle? Well, this is the Jeep. They added a lift kit on it, and where is the secondary? The bumper's at 24 inches. It's 4 inches above the compatibility agreement, and the bar under it that you can see is called the SIA device, the secondary energy absorbing device. It's 22 inches. The 22 inches violates the compatibility agreement. It goes over, and so now when you're in the crash in this Jeep, you're going to bypass the bumper. Why? Because the car that you're striking can't have a bumper higher than 20 inches. It would violate the agreement. And so, when you make a lift kit that raises a bumper this high, that you are absolutely putting a vehicle on the road that's going to crush anything that it hits. What does Jeep say about it? Well, Jeeps, they sell lift kits for their vehicles. They allow you to buy lift kits, but they are very, very particular about what they do when they sell a lift kit. Here is a performance parts catalog that Jeep put out where they talk about lift kits that they sell. Jeep performance parts lift kits are for off-road use only, may not be installed on Chrysler, Dodge, Jeep, Ram, or Fiat vehicles by a dealer. They cannot be sold or financed in conjunction with a new vehicle. And here's the thing: do not drive your vehicle on public roads with the original equipment doors removed. You'll lose the protection they provide. And 2-door kits intended for off-road use only. All occupants must wear seatbelts during off-road use. And then I didn't include it in here, but they've got a similar statement that says that lift kits are, well, it says at the top, are off-road use only and have not been evaluated or tested for crashworthiness or compliance with safety standards. So lift kits are not tested for safety, and they're on off-road use only. Well, people are driving these things on the road every day. Here's another interesting thing. Georgia's got a statute right on point. Georgia says that you can't lift your lift kit more than 2 inches above the factory recommendation of the company. Well, a lot of these, the minimum for many of these lift kits are 2.5 inches. Many of them are more than that. You got lift kits that go as high as 4 inches, lifting that structure higher than Georgia law permits. So not only are you violating the compatibility agreement, not only are you bypassing the structures, but you now violate statutory law of the state of Georgia, putting these lift kits on the roadway. Can you do it better? Absolutely, you can do it better. This is a statement by Honda. This is a vehicle that they make, or Subaru, excuse me, where they talk about reinforcing the structure. As you can see there, they not only reinforce the bumper, the lower level, but the up high on the vehicle. That blue is high strength steel, protecting from not only the crush that would come from a compatible crash, but an incompatible crash. And they use these high strength steel structures to protect occupants in these crashes in the rear, not just in the front. And so that's and here's a little video I found on the internet. I hope you can hear it. Let's see if I can.
The new Volvo C30 is 22 centimeters shorter than its sibling, the Volvo S40. And you will find the difference at the rear of the car. Since impacts from the rear are a type of accident that can cause slow healing injuries to both the neck and spine, Volvo's safety engineers have been focusing on how to make the C30 absorb the same amount of rear impact energy as the much longer S40. At the same time, offer a similar level of protection in the Volvo C30. The rear safety structure is designed with an optimized mix of different grades of steel to provide strength and carefully controlled deformation in a rear impact at both low and high speeds. Like this one, in which we let a 1,700 kilogram S80 drive into the rear end of the C30 at 56 kilometers or 35 miles per hour. The crash test shows how the rear cross member, which is made of ultra-high strength steel, distributes the impact energy in the planned way. How the rear side members absorb most of the impact forces in the early phases of the crash as planned. That the fuel tank remains well protected in front of the rear axle. That the spare wheel moves slightly upwards, not to affect the energy absorption. And that the head restraints not only help protect the neck and spine, but also help protect the head from glass shatters. The Volvo C30 is, of course, also equipped with Volvo's unique whiplash protection system.
And you can see there how Volvo really considers, how is it that we're going to protect occupants in these rear end collisions? And not all car companies do. Why don't they? Again, they don't have to. They can sell the vehicles without doing that and pass the federal standards. They can also, one of the big issues is what you can see. I can kind of predict now, having done several of these cases, which kind of cars are going to do poorly, and it's the smaller sedans that advertise large trunk space. So one of the big marketing pushes that car companies have when they're selling cars is, hey, we've got great cars. We got great trunk space. One of the things Toyota says in their marketing materials is it holds, two sets of golf clubs or something to that effect. And so, what they want to do is advertise large trunk space. Well, when they have this large trunk space, they're not adding additional structure and into that trunk area. They're just putting, sheet metal back there in order to give this trunk space, and it just crushes right through that area of the car. What you could totally use that area to protect occupants by putting high strength steel, again, reinforced areas to keep the car from crushing as much, so that it dissipated the energy, and then reinforce the cabin with high strength steel to stop it at that point and keep it from reaching the occupants. So anyway, that's my presentation on rear end crash worthiness. Really super thankful for all the participants. We had a great number of folks on the line today. I'd love to answer some questions, and so you feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A section there. And I don't see any questions now, but I'll take a moment here, and if you've got any questions, I'd love to answer them. Well, good deal here. Not seeing any questions. I just want to remind. Let's see. How does the weight of the vehicle change? Well, it does. There are some issues I guess what David's asking is, how does the weight of the vehicle change when you add that structure to the back? And so, yeah, it does. When you add structure to the back of the vehicle, it does affect weight, which impacts things such as fuel regulations and stuff like that. Cars have to have emission standards and fuel system requirements. When the weight of the vehicle does matter. So it also impacts other issues. Crashworthiness can be impacted. The deal is, though, is that other car companies are using these high strength steels. High strength steels are typically lighter because you don't have to use as much to get the same resistance profiles. And so a lot of car companies are using those, but that's a great question. And one of the big considerations you got to have, car companies do have to consider that, and it's an issue. So yeah, it does increase the weight, and that's got some negative implications to it. Although that can be, that there are ways to work around that with some of the higher strength steels that's been available for a long time now. Great question. Any other questions? All right. Well, you'll receive an email in the next couple of days with an evaluation form. I hope y'all thought that this was beneficial and helpful and educational. And if not, let me know, and I'll try to do better next time. But there's also 2 remaining webinars this year. Looks like there are going to be one at the end of September and another one in December. Thanks, Mitch. And we would love for you to join us. The presentation that I have, I believe, is available in the chat. And so I hope everybody has a great rest of your day. I know that it's a beautiful day outside. I believe that here in Atlanta, it's supposed to be like 105. So stay inside. Take care, everybody. Have a great day.